The night of November 3rd, 1917, when American blood was spilled on French soil for the very first time in the Great War. But what happened to the men who survived that night was even more terrifying than death itself. Picture this: 20 young American soldiers huddled in muddy trenches near a small French village called Bat-le-Mont. These weren't hardened veterans. They were kids, green, inexperienced. They'd only arrived in France a few months earlier. They were part of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, and they thought this was a quiet sector, a safe place to learn the ropes of trench warfare. The French commanders assured them, "This is a training zone. You'll be fine," but someone forgot to tell the Germans, because the German High Command had been watching. Every day, more Americans arrived in France, and the Germans knew if they didn't break American morale early, these fresh troops could change the entire war. So they hatched a plan, a brutal surgical strike designed to kill, capture, and humiliate. They even planned to photograph it for propaganda. They called it Unternehmen Jakobsbrunnen, Operation Jacob's Well, and they sent their best men to do it. Elite Stoßtruppen, stormtroopers, specially trained killers armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and wire cutters. These weren't regular soldiers. They were the predecessors of modern special forces, and they were coming for blood. At 2:30 a.m., November 3rd, 1917, hell arrived without warning. German artillery shells began raining down with deadly precision. This wasn't random fire. This was planned, calculated, merciless. The earth shook as explosions tore through the darkness, severing phone lines, cutting communications, and isolating those 20 Americans from any hope of rescue. In the trenches, the men scrambled for cover as mud, fire, and shrapnel exploded around them. 100 yards ahead, 15 more Americans manned 3 guard posts, completely exposed. The barrage lasted 20 brutal minutes, and then silence. The guns shifted their aim south. For a moment, the Americans thought, "It's over." They lifted their heads, peering through the smoke, trying to check on their friends. That's when the real nightmare began. While artillery pounded their positions, 300 German stormtroopers had been crawling through no man's land like ghosts, their faces blackened, their bodies armored, and in their hands, death. German engineers had blown gaps in the barbed wire during the barrage. Now, through those openings, the raiders came pouring in, fast, silent, unstoppable. They hit the junction of the Est and Boyau Nord trenches like a tidal wave. One group rushed Boyau Nord, killing an American sentry before he could even scream. In the Est trench, it was chaos. Shadows materialized into armed men, shouting in German, showing no mercy. The Americans were disoriented, terrified, overwhelmed, and the assault was just beginning. 3 young Americans made their stand that night, and they would become the first combat deaths in American history in World War I. Corporal James Bethel Gresham, just 24 years old from Evansville, Indiana, had actually volunteered to take an extra shift that morning because a fellow soldier complained about having cold feet. That act of kindness cost him his life. Private Merle David Hay, only 21, from Glidden, Iowa, had enlisted voluntarily, even though he was too young for the draft. He had written his mother just days before telling her not to worry. Private Thomas Francis Enright, 30, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the most experienced of the 3. He had served in China, fought in the Philippines, and chased Pancho Villa in Mexico. If anyone should have survived, it should have been him. But war doesn't care about experience or good intentions or promises to your mother. There's an account, and I don't know if it's completely true, but it's been told so many times that it captures something essential about that night. They say that in the confusion and darkness, with smoke drifting through the trenches and uniforms covered in mud and blood, Corporal Gresham didn't immediately recognize the approaching soldiers as Germans. He supposedly called out, "Don't shoot, I'm an American." The response was a bullet between his eyes. Hay and Enright fell nearby, their bodies later found among the wreckage. They died fighting, but they died all the same. The entire raid lasted less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That's all it took for the Germans to kill 3 Americans, wound 5 more, and capture 11 others. As quickly as they had appeared, the stormtroopers vanished back into the darkness, dragging their American prisoners with them. Among those captured was Sergeant Edgar Morrison Halliburton, a North Carolina native who had been in the Army since 1909. He was struck in the back of the neck with a rifle butt, and as he was dragged away from the trench, still dazed and bleeding, he caught a glimpse of his fellow soldiers, some dead, some wounded, all abandoned. That image would haunt him for the rest of his life. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that most people don't know about. The captured Americans were marched behind German lines to a staging area near Metz. They were dirty, bloodied, exhausted, and traumatized. And then the Germans started photographing them extensively. This wasn't just documentation. This was psychological warfare. The Germans understood the propaganda value perfectly. These were the first American prisoners of war, visual proof that the vaunted American reinforcements could be defeated, captured, humiliated. They planned to distribute these photographs throughout Germany and to neutral countries, showing the world that American soldiers were no different from any others. They bled, they died, they surrendered. But Sergeant Halliburton refused to cooperate. In one photograph that would become famous, he stood before the camera with his jaw set, his chin thrust forward, one hand clenched in a fist, and the other deliberately thrust into his breeches pocket. An action American soldiers were specifically trained never to do. He wanted anyone looking at that photograph to know he was sending a message of resistance, not defeat. I faced my tormentors defiantly with hands clenched and chin out-thrusted, he later wrote. From time to time, we were compelled to pose for Army photographers. I wouldn't play the enemy's game. The Germans distributed these photographs widely, hoping to demoralize incoming Allied troops. But the plan backfired spectacularly. When the Allies got hold of the images, they used them for their own propaganda, particularly that photo of Halliburton's defiance. A sculptor named Cyrus Dallin saw the photograph at a Boston bond-raising drive and was so moved that he created a bronze statue called Captured but Not Conquered, immortalizing that moment forever. After 30 days at Metz, the 11 captured Americans were separated and shipped to various prison camps across Germany. Halliburton and Private Clyde Grimsley, an accomplished cornetist who had requested transfer from the military band to the infantry because he wanted to fight, were sent to Tuchel prison camp in West Prussia. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found there. Tuchel had been hastily constructed at the start of the war to hold over 137,000 Russian prisoners captured after massive German victories in the East. The camp had been built by Russian prisoners themselves using forced labor. By 1917, it also held Romanian prisoners who were dying at horrific rates. The conditions were beyond nightmarish. The Allied naval blockade had created famine throughout Germany. Prisoners were the absolute last to receive what little food remained. American POWs arriving at Tuchel in the winter of 1917 faced immediate starvation. Halliburton watched his fellow prisoners waste away day by day. They were forced into heavy labor, cutting timber in frozen forests and hauling wood miles back to camp through bitter winter cold. Men collapsed from exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. The camp had no proper medical facilities, and the few doctors who existed were overwhelmed. Private Grimsley contracted tonsillitis and bronchitis after just 3 months and spent 5 weeks in the camp hospital recovering. When he finally got out, he worked as an orderly, helping 2 American doctors who were themselves prisoners. Faced with the very real possibility of starving to death, Sergeant Halliburton began a campaign that would save lives. He started sending postcards to the Red Cross, begging for food parcels to be sent to the camp. Day after day, week after week, he wrote postcards. He organized other prisoners to write as well. He made it his personal mission to ensure the Red Cross knew about Tukul, knew about the dying Americans, knew they needed help desperately. For 4 months, absolutely nothing happened. Imagine the desperation of those 4 months, watching men grow weaker every single day, wondering if your postcards were even reaching anyone, questioning whether the outside world even knew or cared that American soldiers were dying slowly in a German prison camp. Then, in the spring of 1918, a miracle arrived. Red Cross parcels. The food in those parcels literally saved lives. Canned goods, dried fruits, chocolate, coffee, crucial nutrition that helped American prisoners regain their strength. The death rate slowed. Halliburton's postcards had worked. After 7 months at Tukul, Halliburton was transferred to Rastatt prison camp in Baden, Germany. There, he found himself among approximately 500 American prisoners, and that number kept growing as the war continued. And this is where Halliburton did something truly extraordinary. Recognizing that German authorities were using propaganda to manipulate and divide the American prisoners, he began organizing resistance from within. He established a camp structure that gave every man a job and a sense of purpose. He handpicked an intelligence staff whose sole job was to monitor German propaganda and counter it among the prisoners. The prisoners elected him as their camp commander. Even the Germans officially recognized him as the head of all American prisoners in the camp. Think about that for a second. Here was a sergeant, a relatively low-ranking enlisted man who, through sheer force of personality, organizational skill, and moral authority, became the leader of hundreds of American prisoners in enemy territory. He maintained discipline, morale, and loyalty among men who were starving, exhausted, and thousands of miles from home. German propaganda teams tried everything to break American morale. They showed prisoners German newspapers claiming Allied defeats. They spread rumors that America was losing the war, that President Wilson had been overthrown, that German victory was inevitable. Halliburton countered it all. He organized his intelligence staff to debunk every lie. He kept detailed records of what the Germans said and when, tracking their propaganda campaigns and warning prisoners not to believe them. He maintained an underground communication network that spread the truth as best he could determine it. It was psychological warfare fought not with bullets, but with words, rumors, and the battle for men's minds. Meanwhile, Private Grimsley found his own way to resist. Despite the horrific conditions, despite the hunger and cold and disease, he refused to let the Germans break his spirit. He played his cornet. He gave concerts in the camps, bringing music to men who had forgotten what beauty sounded like. He played at the funeral of an American prisoner, giving that fallen man dignity in death that the Germans had denied him in life. In a place designed to strip away humanity, Grimsley used music to remind his fellow prisoners they were still human, still capable of creating something beautiful, still alive in the ways that mattered most. Back in the United States, news of the November 3rd raid spread slowly, but with devastating impact. The deaths of Gresham, Hay, and Enright shocked a nation still coming to grips with its entry into the war. These weren't soldiers who died in some grand battle or heroic charge. They had been killed in a brutal, sudden raid in what was supposed to be a safe training sector. The families were destroyed. Gresham's mother learned her son had been shot between the eyes. Hay's parents discovered their 21-year-old boy, who had written them cheerful letters, was dead. Enright's family learned that even his years of experience hadn't been enough to save him. On November 5th, 1917, the three men were buried near the battlefield where they fell. French authorities placed a marker on their graves with words that echo through history. Here lie the first soldiers of the illustrious Republic of the United States who fell on French soil for justice and liberty. The German propaganda machine went into overdrive. They told their soldiers and the world that Americans could be defeated easily, that they bled, died, and surrendered just like anyone else. But the Allies brilliantly turned it around. Using the same photographs, particularly Halliburton's defiant image, they told a different story. Look how brave Americans are even in captivity. Look how they refuse to be broken. This is the spirit that will win the war. The raid that was supposed to demoralize the American Expeditionary Force instead galvanized it. The deaths became rallying points. The defiance became inspiration. And what the Germans intended as proof of American weakness became evidence of American resolve. For Halliburton, Grimsley, and the other 9 Americans captured that night, the war became an endless waiting game. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. They watched new prisoners arrive, heard rumors of battles, tried to piece together what was happening from fragments of information. Halliburton continued his leadership at Rastatt, fighting daily battles against German propaganda and despair. Grimsley played his music and helped other prisoners survive. By the summer of 1918, rumors circulated that Germany's military situation was deteriorating. The prisoners didn't know the full extent, that the German spring offensive had failed, that American troops were flooding France by the hundreds of thousands, that the Allied counteroffensive was pushing German forces back. But they could see it in their guards' faces, hear it in the increasingly desperate tone of propaganda, sense it in the way. Conditions got even worse as Germany's resources stretched to breaking point. The armistice came on November 11, 1918. 1 year and 8 days after the raid that captured them, the war was over. Germany had surrendered. They were going home. But liberation wasn't immediate. The logistics of repatriating thousands of prisoners took time. Grimsley wasn't freed until December 1918 and didn't arrive home until February 19, 1919, more than 14 months after his capture. He returned to find his fiancée, Mary Crandall, still waiting for him. They married, built a life together, and Grimsley lived until 1967. Halliburton returned home to a hero's welcome. He had survived 7 months at Tuchel and nearly a year at Rastatt. He had led hundreds of American prisoners through the darkest days of captivity. For his leadership during imprisonment, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the first enlisted men to receive the honor. The citation recognized not his capture, but what he did after, how he organized, led, and protected his fellow prisoners, how he maintained discipline and morale, how he turned a prison camp into a functioning unit that never surrendered its spirit, even when it had surrendered its freedom. In 1921, the bodies of Gresham, Hay, and Enright were returned to the United States and reburied in their hometowns with full military honors. Gresham was laid to rest in Evansville, Indiana, where the community built a house and gave it to his mother. Hay was reburied in Glidden, Iowa, in what's now called Merle Hay Memorial Cemetery. Des Moines named a major road and shopping mall after him, though most people who drive past today have no idea who he was or how he died. Enright was interred in Pittsburgh with full honors. The raid at Battlemont lasted less than 5 minutes. It involved maybe 350 men total. 3 Americans died, 5 were wounded, 11 were captured. By World War I standards, where single battles produced hundreds of thousands of casualties, it was barely a footnote, but it represented something far larger than its size. It was America's first real taste of combat, America's first combat deaths, America's first prisoners of war. It forced the American Expeditionary Force to confront the brutal reality. This war wasn't going to be a glorious adventure. It was a brutal, grinding struggle where good men would die in mud for yards of worthless ground. The 16th Infantry Regiment went on to become one of the most decorated units in American history. They fought at Cantigny, Soissons, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne. They suffered over 4,400 casualties in just 1 year of combat. On D-Day 1944, soldiers of the 16th Infantry waded ashore at Omaha Beach, with their commanders shouting words that became legend. "The only men who remain on this beach are the dead and those about to die. Let's get moving." But it all began in those trenches at Bath-Lamont, where 3 young Americans made the ultimate sacrifice, and 11 others began a journey into captivity that tested everything they knew about courage, endurance, and service. That photograph of Sergeant Halliburton, jaw set, chin forward, hand defiantly in his pocket, became one of the iconic images of American participation in World War I. The bronze statue based on it now stands at the National World War I Museum and Memorial. It captures something essential about the American experience in that war. Not grand strategies or massive battles, but individual defiance of ordinary men who refused to be broken, even when everything around them was breaking. Halliburton died in 1945, 27 years after the armistice. Grimsley lived until 1967. They had full lives after the war, married, raised families, worked ordinary jobs. But they carried with them always the memory of that November night when they were young and the world turned dark and violent, and they discovered within themselves reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. Today, in the small French village of Bath-Lamont, there stands a monument to those first 3 American soldiers who died on French soil. The original was destroyed by occupying German forces during World War II. Apparently, the Germans never forgot that November raid, never forgot the propaganda defeat they suffered despite their military victory. The current monument was dedicated in 1951. Few Americans visit it, few even know it exists. But it stands as a testament to a truth every generation must learn anew. That freedom has a cost. Standing up to tyranny requires sacrifice, and sometimes those who pay the highest price are the ones whose names we forget. They were the first, but they would not be the last. Over the next year, more than 116,000 American servicemen would die in World War I. But Gresham, Hay, and Enright would always be the first to die fighting under the American flag in the Great War, and Halliburton and his fellow prisoners would always be the first Americans captured, the first to face the test of captivity, the first to prove that even in the darkest prison, far from home and seemingly forgotten, the American spirit could not be broken. Their story deserves to be remembered. Their sacrifice deserves to be honored. Their defiance deserves to inspire us still.